The Octarine Tree, a podcast exploring the meaning of ecology, spirit and human relationship. From southwestern Australia, I'm your host, Byron John. G'day mob. Welcome to the Octarine Tree podcast. Today we are bedazzled by the High Priest of Rune Soup, Gordon White. Many of you will probably be familiar with Gordon and Rune Soup because, as I state in the interview, and I mean it, Rune Soup is one of, if not the best things on the internet right now. Rune Soup is it's a blog about magic and a podcast about magic. It's also a thriving member community of people right across the world interested in doing magic, the intellectual and performative understanding of magic, and the improvement of our lives by using magic. He's also president of Permaculture Tasmania and a really bloody nice guy. I've been really looking forward to this talk with Gordon because one of those people who he's actually kind of like a little bit intimidatingly well-read and clever. And I'll listen to Gordon speak and he'll casually drop references to not just works but entire kind of threads, schools of thought that I haven't heard of, and I'll have to kind of pause, take note and go back and reference them later. He drops it like it ain't no thing. But he's also a very, very humble, very human, very approachable chap. Also, this is the first, I think this is episode 16. I have not mentioned this so far, but I have a Patreon account and a PayPal account as well, I believe. I should probably double check that. Definitely have a Patreon account associated with the Octarine Tree podcast, which I love doing very much, and which also takes approximately one work day a week for me to do. So an 8-hour day times what I usually charge. I'm not going to even tell you what that is, but it adds up. So if you do gain anything from these podcasts and you are inclined to do so, it would genuinely mean a lot to me if you could assist in any way. I know you've probably heard that come at you through your earpods in various ways throughout your years in internet land. God knows I have, but it's fucking true. When you're on this end, the production end of something like this, a lot of work goes into it. Yeah, it's a labor of love, that's legit, but any little assistance does go a long way, and it also just helps me and those like me doing these things know that there is in fact an audience. There are people out there enjoying it and listening. So enough of my pining falsetto, and without further ado, Gordon White. Gordon White, welcome to the Octarine Tree podcast. How are you, mate?
I'm very good. How are you?
I'm good, thank you, mate. You're in Tasmania as we speak?
Yes, indeed. Yep.
Whereabouts in Tassie? I've been to Tassie before, but I haven't had a really thorough look around. Whereabouts in Tassie are you?
So I'm in the Huon Valley, which is, I'm about 50 minutes drive south of Hobart. So we're in the southeast.
Right, you're right down there.
Yeah. This is Australia's southernmost municipality.
Right, okay. You are not from Tassie, correct?
No. I'm from Newcastle, New South Wales. Born and raised, University in Sydney.
Oh, you're from Newey.
Oh, yeah, Newey boy. And then my dad's side's actually from Perth. So growing up, I would spend my Easter holidays in Cottesloe and Dalkeith because they were a bit fancy.
Really?
Yeah.
Dude, I'm in Dalkeith.
No way, nice one.
Yeah, I grew up, I don't like to tell everyone, but I grew up smack bang in the leafy green western suburbs of Perth.
There you go.
Without giving too much information away, is that the White side of the family? Because everyone in this area knows one another, so there is actually a good chance I know members of your family.
Very likely. And it's on that side, it was an unusual agricultural family going back a few generations. So my grandfather's grandfather, if I got that right, invented a new way of irrigating wheat that allowed for the sort of colonization to continue in the northern part of the state. So there's a sort of agricultural lineage on that side. But,
Right. Okay.
There you go.
Right. Okay. Now, forgive me. I don't want to steal your shtick. And I should let you know, I was a member of Rune Soup for a while. And then when COVID hit and kicked me in the money balls, I pulled out temporarily. But I do plan to rejoin. So, yeah, I am familiar with what you do and your work and whatnot.
Well, I could kind of tell from the octarine, right? That's a very specific term in Magic Land.
Yeah, I was playing with that for quite a long time ago. That was a song I wrote. The Octarine Tree is a song that I wrote that came out of a little like self-made nursery rhyme that I used to sing my kids about. We'd go to find the nectarine tree that was in a laneway in our suburb, and it just evolved into Octarine. But yeah, I've been playing with magic for some time, and I came across Rune Soup. I have a dear friend, shout out to Bob Nekrasov. He was insisting that I get onto Rune Soup for years and years, and it was one of those things. I was like, yeah, okay, I'll get there. And eventually I found it, and I was like so proud of myself for finding this thing all by myself. And I actually think Rune Soup is probably the best thing on the internet at the moment. It's fucking amazing.
Oh, well, thank you. It's a lot of work. So did you come to Octarine before we continue? Did you come to Octarine directly via Pratchett or Pratchett via Pete Carroll?
Carroll.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah, I stink of it. I'm familiar with Rune Soup and what you do, but I've not heard a lot of interviews that you've done with others so much. So I'm not entirely aware of your story, your biography. So again, not to steal your shtick, but were you a weird kid?
Definitely. Part of it was being sort of precocious in the sense of hitting milestones quite early. So, there's some stuff, and talk about beginners, you mean to continue, like being 4 years old and sort of propped up at the bar at a hotel in Fiji, and because my father's a doctor, and so we're there with visiting doctor family friends and so on, and one of these doctors came up to the bar, and I'm like, Malcolm, can I buy you a drink? Because the Fijians were very impressed at this idea of this small child drinking fire engines and just like ordering them. But yeah, no, I read Lord of the Rings independently at the age of 6. Now, I didn't, which is to say I finished the book. I sat there and read through it, and I've obviously read it dozens of times since. So I have no memory of the world without Middle Earth. It kind of emerges from that sort of edge of gloom of childhood memory.
Yeah.
And different parts of it come into an awareness and consciousness. So there's a sort of precocious milestone hitting, which allowed me, I think, to be a bit aware of other weird kid stuff that happened. So I had your kind of classic hag attack, sleep paralysis experiences, and things that may or may not have been screen memories of a sort of classic UFO account. Because I can remember being a repeated nightmare where I would be immobilized and it would feel like I would shrink and so that the weave of the fitted sheet would become as thick as ship ropes, and that would kind of trap me. And I'd have these visions of like really large knitting needles because I was so small, and then like a Romulan warbird was sort of floating around. And so it's this childlike attempt, I think, if you look at that from a motif perspective, you've got immobility and needles and a child's understanding of, what is this sort of spaceship stuff. And so I had these recurring, really potent, immobilizing nightmares, and similar ones with the classic hag attack experience. So there's stuff like that went on. In that sense, I was weird. I found magic at 13. And again, it's another dream experience that I should probably get. I should probably do some hypnosis and find what it was. But like one Saturday morning at the age of 13, I kind of sat bolt upright and was sort of aware that I'd had something had happened in dream. And I walked down the hill. This is when I was in Newcastle. I walked down the hill from Merriweather Heights into the junction, which is about a 5-6 kilometer walk to what used to exist back in the day, which was very good independent bookstores. And this one is called Book Hog. And I walked in, and with the money I'd made from refereeing soccer, and bought a bunch of like Llewellyn, Wicca, and Druidry books, and a packet of cigarettes because I was 13, and I sat in the grandstand Townsend Oval, where I played rugby and smoked cigarettes and read these books, and it was off to the races after that. But that Saturday morning story began in dream, and I don't know what the dream is.
Do you continue to experience sleep paralysis?
No.
Okay. Because it's something I had a lot as a kid, right? That whole like sleep paralysis and the whole like suite of phenomena and that come along with it, like a really strong sense that there is at least another entity in the room or in the space, like undeniable sense, strong sense, and
Totally.
the buzzing sounds and the flashing lights, and for me a sense of foreboding. And I still experience them. I had one the other day, and it was the first time someone has woken me up. I was lying next to my partner, and I've had it in the past where I know I'm in it because I still get them in adulthood. I can be quite lucid in them, and I'm aware that I'm in this space, and it's a disturbing feeling. And there have been times where I've been like, no, maybe you just need to get through this boundary of fear, this membrane of fear, and let's see what's on the other side. But I always black out from consciousness once I do that. I don't know what's on the other side once I relax through it. So, and the instinct is always to like push away. There's this kind of animal instinct. So weird. This is so strange. This is so foreboding. I want out. This is menacing. And in the past, I've tried to like make noise so my partner will wake me up, and I've never done it before until the other night. So I got to experience me doing that, like pulling all of my energy and strength together to just like try to scream her name. And of course, like all she heard was like, but she actually pulled me out of it. And it was the first time that I've actually been able to experience being pulled out of this weird hypnagogic state by the stimulus of someone outside of it. So it is funny. It's a strange thing. So
because it stopped once I found magic and I started warding myself and my house.
Right.
Because it is a being. It's funny, the buzzing thing you mentioned, one of the screen memories, like I didn't want to say this because it just seemed too 80s.
Right.
But the He-Man character Buzz Off would also show up.
Which one was him?
He was the bee. He was the kind of like bee man one.
Yeah. I had the figure of him.
Yeah, same. But it was the rubber head came off. Terrible action figure.
Had cool wings.
Yeah. Anyway, it's funny you mention that because my experiences of when it would happen as a child would be you would sort of stir and this being would be in the corner of the room like a hag. And it would be waiting in the corner of the room until you became fully cognizant that this was about to happen. So it waited for you to know because it feeds off your fear. So it has to know that you are aware of it, or else you're just not lunch. And then it will come up really, really close, and you're in that kind of situation of absolute terror and not being able to move and refusing to open your eyes. But it waits for you to be aware that it's in the room for it to happen. And I one time I had an attack up here visiting friends in Maroochydore. This would have been late 80s. And so it wasn't confined to my house. And my little brother, we were all sharing the room, the kids' bunks and whatever. And I, again, kind of that try to get people's attention to wake me up, screaming this loud. And he'd just come back from the bathroom or something. So I managed to get him to get my mother to like shake me out of it. But that was the one time. If you like, I think, and I met a friend of a friend, actually, Greg Carlwood's wedding. He had a friend who's obviously adult who has had persistent hag attack sleep paralysis experiences too. And they're easy to buy these things in Texas. But if you go to a Botanica and get some sort of a fairly basic house protection kit, see what happens. Because it is, house protection is in fact one of the easiest forms of magic. We kind of intuitively know how to do it because humans dwell and make habitat. And that's one of the fun overlaps, I think, between something like magic and permaculture.
Yeah, okay, I'll look into that. This last attack, funnily enough, it wasn't in my house. It was like a little motel thingy. And you're right, there is something about them or the phenomena, they, knowing that you're aware of them. Because another thing that I used to have was there would be the buzzing and the flashing lights and whatnot, but I would have this... It's so poltergeist now I'm thinking about it, but they're here... thought that would go through my head, like, oh, they're here. and then
Yep.
bam, I'd be into it. Not to stretch the point out too much, but there was a time I was in Morocco and I had the most intense, like, nighttime hypnagogic somniferous experience that I won't bore you or the listeners with. But the next night, I was really kind of concerned about what would happen. And this thing came at me from the back and was snarling and kind of, actually, I could feel myself physically moving. But I remember kind of just like, for whatever reason, laughing at it and chuckling at it and telling it I loved it. And it just flitted off, kind of disappointed.
Nice.
Funny experiences. Okay, so Fiji, you spent a fair bit of time back and forth from Fiji as a kid. It wasn't just a one-off.
Oh yeah. So my speaking of the Perth side of the family, my grandfather, there goes my neighbor in a tractor. My grandfather was part of colonial administration. So my dad's dad ran parts of Nauru and New Guinea as a career.
Right.
So my aunt is actually New Guinean. She lives in Perth. Dad grew up there.
Right.
So, and in Nauru, and in fact, at the university with the intention of moving back to New Guinea and doing that, but he found his first wife at university, and that is history. So he grew up in an island context, and that meant that he couldn't go a year, not in a creepy way, but like home for him is Melanesia and Polynesia. That's what it feels like and smells like and sounds like. And my mother likes warm temperatures. So it was kind of interesting in the 80s because Fiji kept having coups that I remember once, and this is such a childish thing, right? I remember complaining to my parents, why are we going to Fiji again? Everyone else is going to the Gold Coast from Newcastle. And Mum explained, like, because it's cheaper. It is literally cheaper for a family of 5 to go to Fiji than it is to the Gold Coast. And I don't know what's wrong with them. They're like worried about a little coup or something. And that was actually true. So with the exchange rate and the rest of it, it was cheaper for Newcastle to go to Fiji with a family of 5. So consequently, that's my childhood holiday place. We would go diving and all over the Pacific, Solomons, where else? Where haven't we? And but Fiji in particular looks and smells like the afterlife to me. I had some very strange spirit experiences there growing up too.
When you were 13, that's when you said you bought magical books? Is that when you went to the bookstore? Is that what you said?
Yeah. So that's when I decided that I was gonna be about this.
Okay. So at somewhere around that stage beforehand, you were conscious, explicit that this was going to be an endeavor. You were going to explore magic.
I just woke up one day and I did magic, like as in that was my home. My home was magic. It was weird, and that hasn't gone away.
Okay.
It's a very long phase if it's a phase.
And did you kind of tiptoe through the new age and kind of fluffier introductory aspects? What did you land on? What did you land with?
Chaos magic fairly quickly. So at first I thought it was, because I read some Wicca books and I'm like, this is nonsense, no offense to Wiccans. And so I'm like, well, maybe it's Druidry, and that wasn't it. But again, this is sort of like reading 2 or 3 books, sort of looking for an identity. And then I read Pete Carroll's books and I'm like, this is it. This is what I've been looking for. So I sort of, and then read, because they were very easy to buy, even in Angus Robertson in the early 90s, like the Satanic Bible and the Satanic Rituals. And I'm like, maybe I'm going to do this. So me and some sort of goth friends in high school decided we were going to be a satanic coven for a hot minute. That definitely was a phase.
Yeah. I can still remember my father, his horror when he saw me reading the Satanic Bible at the age of 15. He couldn't believe it. Poor bastard.
Yeah. I lent a copy to my friend whose mother burnt it. Like she found it in his stuff and burnt it and was terrified. And that was my first realization, because you just think you're cool when you're a kid. Like, oh, look at me, I'm edgy. Yeah. That's my first realization that actually people are scared of this.
Yeah.
Anyway, phase. So it was chaos magic. Yeah.
Chaos magic.
It was a real 90s mood, I guess. X-Files was on TV, Invisible's comics, Pete Carroll's books, which it must be said by then we're getting on for almost 10 years old. And then some of them were 10 years old. So I've met Pete a few times, and it's not that he disavows his original books, but he does go to trouble to point out that they are now almost 50 years old, right? Yeah. So there's his thinking has moved on quite a bit since then. But that was it for me. It was a framework that worked really well moving into university, doing film, because chaos magic in my hands in the 90s was almost like a I lived postmodernism / post-colonialism. It allowed me to approach texts in, I would say, a better way than we were doing at university, even though they were doing postmodernism and what have you. So it was just a really useful way of playing with identity, which is what adolescence is. So, and it just kind of stuck. The mouthfeel of chaos magic, and its invitation to experiment was really interesting to me.
Yeah, the latter, its invitation to experiment, it kind of gave me a sense of permission's probably not the right word, but yeah, a permission to experiment. There is no way, and just go out and explore. There's something about having found something like that in formative years that just fosters an elasticity of mind.
Yes.
That I'm really glad personally that I had discovered early on. That I didn't practice with a capital P for a very long time, and to be honest, I need a good kick in the bum regarding my practice. But yeah, having discovered those things in formative years, and just as opposed to maybe coming across it in mid-20s or 30s, there's huge difference, I think. Where did you meet Pete?
In Bristol. So that's where he lives and works. And when we moved to London in 2008, it was the worst time in the history of money to move to London. It was easy to get a job during the Blitz in London than when I was there. There were a few moments, because it was just as Lehman Brothers had collapsed and so on. And so I'd be in the HR department of these large kind of like networks, talking about what I could do for their ad sales team or whatever. And unbeknownst to me, that night, their CFO had called up the Chancellor of the Exchequer and said, like, if you don't fix this, I can't pay my workforce of 100,000 people. And the rest. Right. Not a good time. Anyway, consequently, we ran out of the money we saved. And I found a job with the BBC on Gumtree by accident. And it was in Bristol, because that's where BBC Magazines was. So we'd run out of money, and I'd gone to visit some friends in Bristol, and I got this job with BBC Max, and that was our savior. So we moved out of, and this is the strange thing. So Pete's business, I didn't know any of this stuff before I moved there, shares a lane with the apartment we were in. So Rune Soup started when we'd just been through this traumatic experience of 3 months of job hunting and losing all our money and everything in London. And then we sort of arrived with our last dollar in Bristol. And the apartment that we'd picked shared a laneway, because it was in the middle of town, with the business that Pete runs. I'm not sure if he still does, but because he's getting on for retirement age.
Right.
But because I remember thinking, like, oh, this is sort of the home base in a funny way of chaos magic, although it actually did begin more or less in Stoke Newington in North London. So I met Pete a couple of times there, and at his book launch and some Glastonbury events and things. You just, after a while, you fall into the the UK magic scene.
Yeah. I lived in Bristol for a while.
Oh, nice. Whereabouts?
Yeah, Corn Street.
Ah, right in Bristol.
Yeah, I must say, it creeped me out. I got out of Bristol pretty quick. I was there for about a month, and it was actually the first time in my adult life I can remember this gross acceleration of psychic phenomena, and just, good old-fashioned synchronicity, and the shit was just turned up to 11.
Yeah.
The minute I landed in Bristol, and this bizarre theme of vampires that was coming up around me, but just like utterly undeniable synchronicity regarding vampirism, but like actual vampire, like I want to suck your blood, Dracula kind of motif vampire.
Yeah.
It was an incredibly rich time there. Like I remember just walking into a club, and it was DJ Shadow and Tom York doing a little secret gig. It was just one of these places where incredible shit happened, terrifying and wonderful.
Yeah, that sounds about right. It is. Bristol has more ghosts than people think, right? Because actually a lot of the slave money built Clifton. So it is quite vampiric, and it's a very difficult, you have to go through things to learn to love it. And I actually, because I was only there for about 3 months, and I couldn't tell if I didn't like the place or if I was just and it was a bit of both, utterly, completely destroyed and traumatized and depressed from what had just happened in London. So I couldn't tell. And I wasn't really enjoying the BBC Mags job. And then Discovery Channel called me from London, because I'd gotten down to the last final 2 or 3 in a job interview round for them. And the other 2 pulled out. So that's how I ended up back in London after only 3 months in Bristol. But I know exactly what you mean, because it's There is something beautiful and actually terrifying about it. It's got pirates and slave ghosts and all this kind of cool stuff. But we're in Old Market, so only a walk through the park from you, and that was that's Old Templar land. That's where the name, like, so we're Old Temple Roundabout. So it had, like, Bristol has all these weird layers of slavery and Templars and pirates. But also not just slavery, the beginning of the abolitionist movement at the Seven Stars pub, which was one of our locals, and all that kind of stuff. All that stuff is really present in Bristol, and you kind of have to be an historian to live there without going crazy.
It's rich. I mean, for those listening as well, there's suburbs and roads in Bristol are named after the camps where they would segregate the slaves into like white boys and black women, and it's a pretty it's certainly got a strong mojo down there. So what took you home from the UK back to Australia?
A lot of stuff, magic mostly. Like, it was another dream experience, but I woke up one day in our West London share house and sort of turned to my partner and say, I think we end up on a permaculture farm in southern Tasmania. And that turned out to be right. So now we have a permaculture farm in southern Tasmania that looks exactly like that. Evening in the front room of our Chiswick house, we sat down and like, well, what do you want? Because we did look everywhere. The dream told me where we would be, but we still approached it with the rationality of, because I love the Welsh borders and all these places. So we looked at places still in the UK, and then coming back to Australia, we looked at, it had to be a river because we wanted that. So we looked at like Bellingen and the Huon and the Tamar and all these great places, right? And it drove, my way of thinking kind of drove Dad nuts. He's like, well, what are you going to grow? And I'm like, well, it depends where we are. And it's like, if we'll do avocados in like Bellingen, but we won't do them in the Huon. And he's like, but what do you want to grow? And I'm like, it depends where we are. So it's that kind of, he thinks we came back to be farmers. And I'm like, that's not it. It's about that, the thing that permaculture isn't good at, which is speaking the language of a living cosmos. I'm like, where can I be in relation with specific beings along whose journey I can participate or co-participate? So that's how it was. I mean, I was definitely a lot better at magic then than I was when I went. So it was an odd realization, which is one of the things you should pay attention to. Jung understood this, right? That you should turn a friendly face to the unconscious. So if you get messages in dreams and you ignore them, they'll stop talking to you.
Yes.
But if you listen to them, they'll talk to you more. And so I listened, and everything. I wanted a 19th century house because I'm, I don't know, gay, and James wanted to be on a river. And we needed high-speed internet access for my job, and we didn't want to be in a town, but we wanted walking distance from town and all this kind of stuff. And for our price point, being able to, and obviously we want Airbnb, so we wanted room to build something, and we got all of that. We're on a river we can drink from. The front half of the house is from 1885. There already is a separate guest house, all within our price point, high-speed internet, and I can walk into the closest town, which is Chiefston. And that's magic for you, right? Like, we were doing that manifestation, and I didn't know it existed, right? But that's your kind of dialogue with the future self or unconscious. So that's how we came back. We were summoned, for better or for worse.
Okay. And is this where you are now? Is this the first time you've had extended put down roots relationship with a patch of dirt and all that comes with it?
Well, not extended relationship, but an ownership, custodianship relationship. Right. So this was the first time we've scaled up from keen gardening to permaculture. So it's only 5 acres, but 5 acres is a lot when you're used to a garden.
5 acres is actually a really nice, snug size.
I think so. I think that's that Bill Mollison thing, right? Of like, buy the smallest possible piece of land and get it to be as productive as possible. And I'm really into that.
How does it feel? Because I've spent 10 odd years living in the bush in southwestern Australia, down Margaret River Way. I was at Zaytuna Farm for a good year and a bit. I was in New Zealand for ages. I've spent a fair bit of time in the bush and in the country. I'm currently in the city. It's funny, like I spent my entire adult life kind of expecting and preparing for the apocalypse. And then when the closest thing to it had arrived, I found myself in the middle of the city, having just moved out of the country. That's a whole different story. But How does it feel for you? Like, do you ever long for, would you like to have a portal that would send you back to London or Main Street here or there? Or are you really happy being where you are in the
It's
countryside?
both, right? So last year, because I'm an anarchist and you can't be anti-state and pro-lockdown, before last year, I would actually spend, so 2019, I spent a quarter of the year out of the state. And that was, I did events at the Guggenheim, I was on ayahuasca retreats in Peru, all this kind of stuff. So I had an international life.
Yeah.
And now I don't. So there was a tremendous amount, and it's not coming back for reasons that we can talk about privately. But so there's a lot of grieving that when I moved down here, I was not informed that I wouldn't be able to leave it.
Yeah.
So I love it here, and I've nevertheless gone through like I've had to process a lot of trauma from the last year about realizing that a life that I worked 20 years for is not going to happen. I was in London when this power grab began, and sort of had to flee back, last helicopter out of Saigon. But I was also going to spend 2 months, I was finishing a book in Cusco and building water tanks for the Kuntanawa in Brazil and all this kind of stuff that was going on, that was going to happen last year. Oh, another event at the Guggenheim over the summer. All this stuff that now isn't postponed, never happens. You sort of slip out of that timeline. So how it feels is I love it here. I thank whatever you want to call it every day, the profound gratitude for being here in this context in the Huon Valley. The mountain beings and forest beings that I'm in relation with are just wonderful. If I was ever to be locked up anywhere, this is quite a good one, right? So it's both. It's wondrous being here. This is absolutely where we're meant to be. And funny, you kind of reversed the apocalypse. We showed up just in time for it to be like, well, actually, this is quite a good bolt hole. It wasn't necessarily why we picked it. Although, as I kept saying to my family, again, my father who wanted me to like, well, what are you growing? And I'm like, shut up. I'm like, I'm not expecting the collapse of Western civilization, but if it does happen, I'm in a pretty good spot. However, I like living there. So it's like scenario planning where this is quite a good place to bug out if bugging out is required. But if it's not, I live in the Huon Valley in southern Tasmania. It's wonderful.
Yeah. I found myself living in a beautiful eco-village in New Zealand at the Permaculture Research Institute of New Zealand for December of 2012. That was my intended forever place, bug out, but that never occurred. But you did a great episode. I think it was a solo show on grieving for what, potential futures or ideals and ideas that have been lost due to the quote unquote pandemic. I found that so healing. Thank you for that.
That's really nice to hear.
Oh no, it was so fucking great.
Was this the recapitulation one at the end of last year?
Yeah. And I found myself walking through the woods in a park in Perth, just going, oh fuck yeah! I hadn't even kind of come to the place where I could articulate that yet, because I think I was in a bit of denial still. But it was like, nope, he's fucking right. There are things that just aren't going to occur now, and I have to recalibrate where I'm at and what I'm casting forth, and grieve for things I didn't even know I was, all these assumptions came to the surface. So that was really valuable. Thanks for doing that.
No, thank you for saying so. It's been a really popular episode, which it's funny that because you do shows as well, right? Yeah. You will have one that it's not that I dashed it off, because I'd obviously spent a year processing my own trauma and being attacked for having what turned out to be correct analyses of the situation and all the rest of it. And so I'd done that, I do magic, but the episode itself took an hour, right?
Yeah.
I thought I'll make these notes and then I'll give people the recapitulation exercise. And it's always the ones, and in the meantime, there's ones where I'll read 100,000 word book and get all these questions together. And I love those beautiful, intense episodes. And then they're middle of the road. But I do this one, and you just never know. You've got to share what's in you. And that's not just podcasting, that's in general. Because if you don't, it's as the Gnostics, the Gospel of Thomas tells us, if you don't bring forth what is within you will destroy you.
Yeah. Amen. The shows that I've had greatest response to are the ones where I just am most vulnerable.
Yeah. That's what it is.
You know, it's not the most clever questions or greatest insights. It's just like spilling my guts, pretty much.
I think that gets back to the feel of original podcasting. That's a keen insight, right? Because I remember way back in the day, before even really mobile phones in the smartphone sense, of when it was iPods podcasts were called that because of iPods, and
Yeah.
I would plug an iPod into my computer. This is living in Auckland, and use iTunes to download like a BBC podcast or something, and I'd listen to it walking around Ponsonby, and I couldn't believe that I could hear voices and even like the saliva ASMR type sounds of someone's voice right in my head as I was walking around. It was so intimate, right? And that was the real potency of early podcasting. And as you kind of say, that can be recovered if you bleed over the airwaves, if you bleed into your MP3, if you do show that vulnerability, because that's what people want. They want the human to human connection. They want to know that there is another being that's inside their head at that moment.
Yeah, I've had a number of great moments like that where it's just someone, whether it's a podcast or certainly in the flesh, just bringing that vulnerability to the room, and this great weight off my shoulders, like, oh, fuck, yeah, I'm allowed to be that too. I'm allowed to feel that and bring that to the surface. There is a great sense of permission that comes from it.
Mm.
So where did you first discover permaculture? Where were you? Were you in London?
Well, so this is a funny story. I somehow knew it existed before I did. And so I obviously did high school in New South Wales, which means we had the HSC. Mm-hmm. And in the lead up, when you're in year 12, the local universities put on, local university departments put on evenings sort of explaining what they're about. And I said to my mother, I want to be an environmental engineer. And she said, why would you want to do that? They just build stormwater drains around business parks. And I'm like, no, they don't. Environmental engineering is like planting denuded hillsides with local endemics and building wildlife corridors and all this kind of stuff. And so she's like, it isn't. And so good mother, she takes me along to the environmental engineering department evening at Newcastle University. And basically one of the first slides is, here's a stormwater drain we build around a business park. Yeah. And I'm like, well, mother knows best. So in my heart, going into university, I knew something like permaculture had to exist. But I'm like, oh, well, I guess that doesn't exist. I'll go and do film, which I did.
Right.
And so I vaguely knew of permaculture in the background, sort of after universities. So I knew it as like a gardening technique, because someone had sort of said, I think I told that story to someone, like, well, you might, what about permaculture? And I'm like, nah, it doesn't sound right. So I knew it existed before it did. And then I kind of got way more into it, probably as in intellectually into it in New Zealand, and then even more deeply. And then we started gardening in rental houses, but not like large-scale gardening, but just beginning that process. My grandfather was a keen gardener and so on, so I had a childhood as a 15-year gap, and then kind of got more deeply into it and in the UK.
Okay, because you're now, is it you preside over Permaculture Tasmania?
It sounds very grand.
Carry a big stick.
Very grand. I'm president of Permaculture Tasmania because no one else wanted the job, as is usually the case with volunteer organizations, but we're the AGM. And not in a mean way, like, but literally no one else had the capacity for it. And I said, well, I'm finishing up a book, but then after that, I probably do have the capacity to step into it. So yeah, I'm president of Permaculture Tasmania, and that's a fun group. And it's really, I think about it in that kind of dramatic sense. It is from here. Like, this is Mecca for permaculture.
Yeah.
And one of the events I did for David, a retro suburbia event I did for David 2020 doesn't exist. In 2019, was actually at Hobart College, which is where Bill and David first met.
Right, yeah.
And that was really exciting to kind of be part of, to be in the resonance of that sort of moment was actually really fun, because David opened his retro suburbia thing by saying, this is, I mean, the building itself is new and actually very nice, but the Hobart College campus is where they met. And I thought that's lovely.
Yeah, David grew up in Fremantle. I've had the pleasure of meeting David on occasion. Upon return to Australia, like, how many years were you away?
15, all up.
Okay, enough. That's a fair stint for the age.
Yes, amazing, given that I'm only 25. Carry on.
Right. Well done, bravo. Did you return to Australia with any new sense of or appreciation for the landscape itself and the history,
Yes.
the place, the culture, the story, the tragedies that had occurred?
Absolutely. So I obviously didn't like the politics of Australia when I left. I left Howard's Australia, and he couldn't even get sorry across the line, right?
Right.
So I found it ghastly, ghastly. I still do at a federal level for the most part. Um, but I also left not liking the landscape. Growing up a weird kid, and in that kind of classic tyranny of distance sense, particularly if you're interested in stuff like magic, it's like, why are there no snow on the hills?
Yeah.
Where are the wolves and like castle ruins
Fully.
and all that kind of thing?
Yeah.
And so I'm like, this is ghastly. And so on my mother's side of the family, we've got family up the Hunter Valley and hinterlands. So we'd spend a lot of time driving up what I now find to be immensely beautiful country. But at the time, I'm like, God, this just makes me thirsty looking at it.
Right.
This is terrible. So
Yeah.
I actually came out, we were still in London before we'd moved back, and I came back for my youngest brother's wedding, and he married a girl who grew up in the Hunter Valley. So it was at Peterson's Champagne House in the Hunter, and obviously like really bougie vineyardy stuff, right? But it was the first time I realized this is actually stunning. And this is my home, and I could approach it from a magical perspective of this is a wine valley attached to a river, and wine Shiraz is called that because of the region that it comes from in kind of like Anatolia. Yeah, and that was originally, so the grapevine was originally as a wild thing, as a ground cover. So it grew as a vine along the ground, and these bitter red grapes, and quite clearly humans 12,000 plus years ago would crush them up and leave them, and wild yeast would ferment them, and that's where wine would come from. And I just kind of had this stacked moment of Australia, and I obviously knew by then, like I knew this in primary school, that we have this preposterous approach to history where we kind of get to sort of 1770 and then just say, and before that Aborigines, like we just,
oh my God,
terrible,
I know,
right? But it was there's a way of understanding history when you realize that the cosmos is alive, that the Hunter Valley is in resonance with that very first, somewhere like Shiraz, but that very first Anatolian river valley where these vines grew, and it's in resonance. It is in a living resonance with it. And you understand that with psychedelics and shamanism and so on. So it opened up not Australian history. It opened up the history of country on a planetary basis by doing that. And so I actually spent the next few days processing my guilt. I wrote a blog post about it many years ago, feeling quite guilty about how I had disparaged my home, and realizing that was, and coming to a new understanding of, so my mother loves Australian landscape and so on from a country family, and kind of almost feeling guilty in a good sense, in a healing sense, of not understanding people who liked it. And now I like country anyway, right? So now I have a different appreciation of it. As for the colonial history, so I'm better at ghosts than I was when I left. A few decades, 15 years of magic later, and I live somewhere. I think I can make the case that this is the worst imperial genocide out of anywhere in the whole empire, which was rather a big place.
Oh, dude, Tasmania to me, when I went there, it was for some birthday, and we stayed at this beautiful place in Launceston, and we were there for like 3 or 4 days, and we're like, well, fuck, if we're here, I want to see Hobart. So one day we did the drive to Hobart. We went to the Salamanca market, Salamanca
yep.
Yeah, which were great, and then drove back. And the whole drive in between, I was like haunted. This place is just dripping. Like it was like
it's wall-to-wall ghost.
It's like a scene from Ghostbusters. Like I could almost see Slimer.
Yep. So whatever that's about is one of the reasons I'm here, and it's about how, and I presume you've read Sand Talk by Tyson Yunkaporta. One of the components of it that I like is he talks about products of thought versus a way of thinking, and kind of White Australia is very interested in the products of Aboriginal thought, but not ways of thinking.
Right.
So the example in the book is that you might have an economics conference on in Sydney, and over the lunchtime break, they'll get a local Aboriginal group in to do like traditional dancing or something. So that's a product of thought, but they won't invite any Aboriginal elders to participate in the economics conference, which is a way of thinking. It's like, what's an Aboriginal understanding of economics? And that's the genius of his book, because that's sort of breaking open the idea of how we can learn from not just Aboriginal Australia, but Indigenous contexts around the world.
Yeah.
And one of them is like, what does custodianship look like when you are not First Nations? And that's a real question for permaculture, because permaculture doesn't yet speak, and I talked to Dan Palmer about this, doesn't yet speak the language of a living cosmos. And it's one of the things that has kept it moribund for a couple of decades.
Yeah.
And there's works like, there's all this post-activist, post-human, Indigenous centering pattern thinking. The whole book is a book about pattern thinking, and that should be permaculture. So one of the reasons I'm down here is, I'm magically operant, I am spirit conversant, and I am not native Tasmanian. And so I'm implicated and in relation with various native Tasmanian groups and projects, and aligned with goals and all that kind of usual stuff. But I'm not. I'm part Jewish, and otherwise I'm Southern English for 1,000 years. So what do I? What do I do? What do I? But that's a really good question, and you don't have the answer for it. If you have the answer, it is not the right thinking to bring to it, right? So one of these thought processes comes from Dr. Donna Haraway and her book Staying with the Trouble. What do you do? Well, you can't solve colonialism. You can't solve genocide. You stay with the trouble, and you have those kind of like multi-species, multi-being, multi-temporal connections and relationships. So that's where I want permaculture to go, and it's where magic is, and I see those two trains coming together.
Oh, I don't know where to take that. I had so many threads.
Sorry.
No, it was great.
No one ever asked me about permaculture, so I have all these takes.
One of the things I love most about permaculture, amongst many, is it's just almost like training, retraining, or reflexing of muscles that we have innately and have always been there, but have kind of atrophied for obvious reasons. Just a conscious observation of land and a tiptoeing back into or forward into a conscious connection and being with country and intelligences beyond the human. And it really assisted me in flexing those muscles over the years, like turning my eyes on. So not just passively observing, but like turning. I even say it to my kids now when we're going walking in the bush. It's like, okay, kids, are you turning your eyes on? Turn them on. And kind of getting this deeper and deeper sensitivity for and appreciation for the world around me, as trite as that might sound. But there's something in the Australian landscape that for me over the last few years, I don't know when really started amping up for me, but maybe the last 5 years, country has just been singing louder and louder and louder and louder. It's like Australia has been kind of, I don't know if like I just didn't have ears to hear it, or if it has been slumbering and just waiting, or what, like, or both but there's something, and I don't know how to articulate what it's saying, but there's this song coming out of the country right now, and I'm fascinated by it. Like now I am never happier now that when I am out bush or on country. And there is just this sense of like most people would be excused for or guilty of feeling like the place where they were raised is mundane. It's the known.
Totally.
And I always saw Australia as that for lots of different reasons, apart from the fact that it was just home, because it's so stable geologically and politically and economically. It just felt so normal and so middle ground. But something occurred to me. It clicked. I was driving around, I think it was like down near the Manjimup area of southwestern Australia. And if you haven't done a really good tour of southwestern Australia before, I do recommend it.
I can't get into your fucking state, Byron. I've been trying for a year.
I know some people, I'll talk to them. But
Nice.
But it is incredible because it is like an island. It's an island of relative green between the sea and the desert, right? It's very Tasmanian in lots of ways. But it just occurred to me like this place is a bloody like primeval wonderland in such a short amount of time, an absolute blink of the eye in terms of prodigious geological and cosmological time period. It was a completely different universe. And I know I'm rambling and I really don't even have a point.
No, I'm into it.
Other than to say there is something coming out of the land at the moment and it is so beautiful and it's a mystery. There is some kind of like secret. It's hinting at a thing. It's hinting at a thing. It's like singing towards this thing. Like, can you see it? Do you see it now? That's it. Isn't it incredible? This is it. Do you see it? And these puzzle pieces kind of falling together.
Yeah, so that's actually what brought me back. So it is in fact about 5 years old, because I agree completely. I can speak with what little authority comes with being a professional magician. Yeah, it's the time has come, and you can actually see the changes. If you look, you can do a cultural analysis of this. So if you look at, say, the Songlines exhibition that happened a few years ago, and the fact that Margot curated, Margot Neal, and obviously Ananu and everyone along the Seven Sisters Songline.
Yeah, I've been to
yeah, stunning. Well, I've been out at Cave Hill, and it was life changing. So anyway, if you listen, and I think Tyson is at the head of this.
Right.
I think the time has come. I think what David Morrell Jalai was trying to do in the 90s is happening now. And country has woken up.
Yep.
The thing about Aboriginal Australia, and it's something Bill said, its principal preoccupation, he said that Aboriginal Australia's principal preoccupation is time.
Right.
So, like, if you look at it from a ceremonial perspective, their understanding of time and deep time and dimensionality and timing and so on is the best in the world. And Australia is the oldest continent on Earth. So it is, the elders have arrived because we have fucked up.
Yeah.
And they are here in a loving way. And the thing that from a spirit perspective, I've struggled with is that we don't deserve it, Byron. We don't deserve to be saved, and we are.
That assistance.
Yeah. And so country is awake in a way that it wasn't when I left. And that's a good sign, but it also might be not a good sign in the sense that
reaping
we're heading to. Yes, exactly. There's no way around that. I'm lineaged in a Kero Andean lineage, and there's a rite called the Mosok Karpai. In 1949, a earthquake happened around Cusco, and this cathedral collapsed, and underneath it was this temple, Inca temple of the sun. Everything's of the sun, but this was a temple where like priests would stay, so it was sort of like a college of sun priests. And this was the sign that the Mosok Karpai rite had to happen, and we were entering the Pachacuti. So Pacha is cosmos, so Pachamama, and so on. It doesn't mean earth, it means like space-time stuff. And Kuti is overturner. So we had reached a time, and all indigenous cosmologies, basically anything but a European cosmology, has a framework of understanding that the entire cosmos will rearrange and recompost itself at different points in time. We have misunderstood that over a period of 2,500 years with Apocalypse, because actually, if you read like Old Testament and Old Testament Apocrypha correctly, when Jews were tribal, we had a tribal understanding that would look, you can kind of squint down. It's not the same, but you can sort of squint down and go, okay, so this is the Israelite experience of something that the Kero also understand, and so on. And where I think in one of those moments now, we're sort of at a confluence of prophecies, Hopi prophecies, Kero prophecies. They're all kind of here-ish. And we have this, we still have a retained Christian notion that this means it's end times. And this happens with climate alarmism and everything else. It is a Christian apocalyptic shape. And that's not good magic. It's the, put it this way, the diagnosis is correct maybe, but the prescription isn't. So it's come to an awareness that this is an unusual moment to be in a body on planet Earth. That's for sure.
Fucking oath. What a really recent Rune Soup episode. I forget the chap's name, Jonathan. it was like talking ayahuasca. And,
Oh, yeah.
And I found, again, speaking of like great aha moments in podcasting history, when you guys were rapping about where, because I have a really, 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 really fucking hard time trying to grok and swallow and be in right relations with what went down on this particular continent.
Yep.
I just can't. I find it really fucking hard. Like, I'm like, what kind of realm am I in where that can occur?
Yep.
And when he was, or maybe it was you, both of you were rapping about how they're not gone. The elders, the ancestors are not gone. They're inhabiting and populating a different place. Like, I think you brought up where the Mayans went, like consciously. They were like, fuck this, we're going to go hang out over there for a while.
That's the understanding of time that I'm talking about. Like shamans step out of time.
Right.
It's a stupid idea that time is only experienced linearly, and that the only people stupid enough to believe that were Northwest Europeans about 300 years ago. No one else anywhere or anyone, including our own ancestors, believed that crap. And it's not even true by the same kind of strictures of materialist science. Like, we're still stuck with this 19th century machine universe when we've had things like quantum physics, and we know that the speed of light has moved in different, like the speed of light was slower in the 20s than it is now, all this kind of shit. And we're still like, nope, time is just one damn thing after another. Fuck off, it is. Yeah. It's at the very least a flat circle, to make a to make a meme reference. But on a real basis, when you're dealing with cosmovisions that have a healthier understanding of time in a living universe, all of a sudden you realize the multidimensional game we're playing. And I know what you mean about the pain of being here. When I would connect to country after coming back, the surface was like a raw nerve. Like, I would cry before I could get down anywhere deep, because it's so recent and so horrible, right? Yeah. And I couldn't even talk about some of the stuff that happened down here. Like, I've done videos. I've done a magical geography course that's very involved in the story embedded in Tasmanian landscape, and I had to stop recording a couple of those times and just take a moment, because it's so much. Yeah. But it's like, what do you do with it? Doing is the problem. You don't do, you just stay with it. We need to be the thing to, we all need to be the thing to grieve. That was actually the point. We had people from like the Sorry movement come to university in the 90s before I left. And they're like, this isn't punitive. It's not, we're not going to sue people. We all need to come around. A really bad thing happened. Yeah. We need to come around and funeralize it, right? Like, totally. Yep. And that's an indigenous way of being with grief. That's an animist way of being with grief.
Do you know the La De Angelis, the work of La De Angelis?
I know the name.
She's a magic practitioner. She's probably getting on close towards 80 now. She lives in Melbourne currently. She wrote a book called Prytanei, and it was about the Roman conquest of Britain. And it's quite elegant, third person like narrative, and really like explicit. I couldn't read it for ages. I could only get through the first 4 or 5 pages, and I had to put it down. I was like, no, not ready for that yet. And from that work, based on that work, she does this like workshopy thing called Rivers in the Skin, and it walks people through that moment in particular, Northwestern European history, where there was a great and abrupt severing and hemorrhaging from connection to country and self and spirit and all those things that occurred then. It gets pretty emotional. She was invited, I don't know exactly who, but there are Indigenous elders in Tasmania who invited her to hold that space in Tasmania. And she was saying amazing things about it, how these particular individuals who do have European blood in them were like mourning that side of their experience, their genetic experience, not just their Indigenous Australian experience of being usurped and everything that comes with it, but the actual now, 2,000-year-old European lineage of that. I recommend you have a sniff out and have a look at that work if you're drawn to it.
Oh, totally. Yeah, we'll do.
All right, mate. I reckon I've probably held you long enough. I would say anyone who's interested in sniffing out Gordon's work further, need only go to Rune Soup. Is it runesoup.com?
That's the one.
Yeah, it's fairly well known. Many people listening to this will already be onto it. But like I said before, it is, in my humble opinion, one of the best things on the internet right now. It's fucking amazing.
Why did you drop me down to one of the best? We started at the best. What have I done to disappoint you so much?
No, I'm sorry. My bad. Yeah, you're right. slapping my wrist. All right, mate. Well, yeah, again, thank you so much. I really enjoyed today's chat, and thanks for everything you do. Hey, I do enough in my day-to-day life to know that the machinery behind Rune Soup, there's a fair bit of work that goes on in that, and thank you for it, because it's incredibly nourishing what you are doing.
Thank you very much for saying so, and this was a fantastic conversation.
Yeah, thank you, mate. And if you ever come to Western Australia, when I talk to the Queen, I'll see if she'll let you in. If you do, you've got a place to stay if you don't really feel like hanging out with relatives in Dalkeith.
That's right. All right, thanks.
All right, mate. All the best.
40 film of mistakes. Check my phone, shitty notifications again. Morning birds, mental girds, the first of 5 espressos. Bus to work, zombie herds, news tie burns. Panic attack, mid-morning snack, post-coffee beta blocker. Found the flame and fed in Maine. God, I miss siestas. Empire slug, a 10-year rut. Scooby snack dispensers. You know we're friends until the end, until the end. I could quit it anytime I want, my friend. My new obsession is to not obsess it all. Now I'm cute, it's fine if I start up again. He's past the magic gym, hamster wheel, quit after first free session. Chasing gin with Vicodin, cry to a Netflix special. OPMT, adrenal fatigue, self-branding masturbation. You know we're friends until the end, 30-year lost weekend.